Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to be back with you. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise, and you have joined CBI at 10. Our topic of discussion this morning is business travel and how that picture is evolving with the changing picture in relation to COVID, testing, vaccinations, and all that good stuff, as well as the impact of Brexit. It's a topic we spoke about some months ago, but there are new things to know and to understand. And as the possibility of business travel sort of looms slightly closer on the horizon for many of us, the need to really get our heads around what changed with Brexit, which has slightly been deferred because of COVID, is suddenly becoming pressing, and the complexity in relation to what you can and can't do and how you get to do it is quite discombobulating. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that with Seema and with Craig shortly. But Matthew has joined us this morning. Good morning, Matthew. As you all know, he's Chief UK Policy Director for the CBI. And there was something of an announcement on Monday, wasn't there, Matthew?
Yeah, good morning, Liz. Good morning, everyone. Yes, absolutely. The big news of the week, obviously, the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday that the final stage of the roadmap, regrettably, has to be pushed back until 19th of July now is the plan. That obviously we'll cover in a moment, and a big disappointment for many firms. But I think important to note, as well as the final step of the roadmap getting pushed out, that also means that the outcome of some of those really important reviews, such as social distancing, COVID secure certificates, and so on, those are also pushed out a little bit. So we're not now expecting to hear details on those until the 12th of July, a week before that key date of the 19th now. I think in terms of reaction, look, clearly this is a big disappointment, especially for those sectors who are really impacted by both either closure or the social distancing measures. So hospitality, leisure, live events, and so on. You know, at the very best scenario for those sectors, they are operating at significantly reduced capacity, and for some, still closed after all these months. I think, Liz, in terms of where we go here from here, you'll recall, I think the CBI said before the announcement even, look, the key messages were we really need to learn to live with the virus. So let's focus on some of those key data points, particularly around hospitalization and deaths and so on, as we adapt to living with the virus. I think the majority of firms, notwithstanding what I've just said about those sectors most impacted, would have taken irreversibility over speed. And that seems to be consistent with what the government have done. And then thirdly, we said, look, if there are to be ongoing restrictions, which is now the case after June, we really need to revisit the support available to firms. And I think all of that holds true now. In terms of what we're hearing, particularly from some of those sectors who are impacted by it, we had a really good conversation with some of the CBI's Trade Association network. I think there's some of the reactions coming through. People say, actually, this has shaken our confidence in the planning a little bit, because we were getting encouraging mood music quite up until the wire, and then all of a sudden we put the brakes on again. So I think in terms of confidence and moving ahead for some, that's been a bit of a knock. To overcome that, I think they've said it'd be really helpful if the government, as much as possible, can show the sort of workings in their margins, so they can understand the rationale and the logic and where the key data points are and so on, as well as using this time wisely. So if we're going to get some fresh guidance when we move into a further stage and so on, let's get that early so that firms can digest it, understand what they need to do, hopefully from the 19th of July onwards. And then a few others, ranging from hospitality through to car manufacturer and so on, saying that getting a mechanism up and running around this test to release idea that we've talked about many times over the past year as part of learning to live with the virus is really important. Look, people get that you're going to get notified, that you may have possibly come into contact, but if we could get that approach working really well, it will minimize disruption and mean that we're able to learn to live with the virus. Just on that point around testing, Liz, we've actually had confirmation, firms have been asking this, that workplace testing and the availability of that, with the government paid for tests that can take place in workplaces, that has been extended through to the new deadline of the 19th of July. So if you are one of those businesses who've previously been registering and operating workplace tests, you can continue to do that and roll that over until the 19th of July. So there's a little bit of progress there and good news, and we're pushing actually for that to continue through to the autumn, but we'll see where we get to on that front. Final few thoughts from me, Liz, on the overall reaction. I think just a reminder really of some of the support that does remain in place for those firms who are still impacted by this. The furlough, the job retention scheme, that remains as it is until the end of July. And then the plan is for the government contribution to just go down a notch from 80% to 70%, with firms having to pay that extra 10%. So that will be an issue for some for those extra couple of weeks into July when the contributions change. Similarly, on business rates, there's 100% rate relief for some of those targeted sectors in hospitality and leisure. That was due to drop to 66%, so 2/3 from the beginning of July. We're pushing to extend that now and in conversation with government around that, so we can see if we can top up that targeted support for as long as the restrictions remain in place. And similarly, on the commercial rent moratorium, that was due to end on the 1st of July. And again, we're pushing for that to be extended in a targeted measure, so for example, a revenue test and so on. And we're hopeful we might get some news on that as soon as today. So watch out for that later on. I think there could be an announcement in Parliament on that. So really, Liz, what we're saying is we need to keep on with sort of targeted support for impacted sectors if we can bridge out those next few weeks and so on. And then in particular, I think people like events, music, performance and so on, government support for some of the insurance so that they can get ahead with planning with confidence would be helpful. And bridging on to today's topic, aviation, probably the hardest hit sector or one of the hardest hit sectors of all. It feels like we really do need further targeted support from them, because that's been probably a little bit lacking to date.
Thanks ever so much, Matthew. I take your point already, a point about confidence being a bit knocked in the planning, because we all felt until quite soon before the announcement that it was all going swimmingly. Do you think that we'll have, you know, touch points between now and July the 19th? Do we have a sense of what might sort of how the picture might evolve in terms of briefings?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think being just crystal clear on what are the data points that are going to tip this sort of thing. I mean, look, I think everybody gets that in an ideal world, you'd have loads of heads up and notice about what's going to happen. But the trade-off there is that you want to push it out as far as possible, so you're working on the latest data points and so on. So there's a balance to be struck there. I think what firms are saying is, look, if we're able to proceed to go, just communicate and keep up the commentary in the intervening weeks. What's going to tip that? So is it about progress and the percentage of the population that has their second vaccination, for example? Is it the key metrics around death rates, hospital capacity, and so on? If we can just get some updates and commentary on those alongside the extra support measures, I think that will give firms the best possible chance of sort of judging the situation and being able to calibrate their plans accordingly.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Let's sort of do a bit of a segue then into the sort of guts of the topic that we're going to talk about today. You mentioned aviation. We're here to try and figure out how the heck we get back to, inverted commas, normal with business travel.
Yeah, exactly. Look, just to kick off for me, Liz, I thought actually, you know, all the focus on this debate and all the media attention is clearly around sort of summer holidays and things like that from a sort of consumer and a tourism point of view. And that is hugely important, obviously, not least for sort of a well-being and everyone needing a bit of a break and so on. But there's a load of different ramifications for business, and I thought it's worthwhile just quickly capturing those. I mean, firstly, as well as outbound tourism, where people go on holiday, the inbound tourism sector is hugely valuable to the UK in its own right. So worthwhile remembering that that is hit until we get this righted and fixed. And then a load of different aspects for business. So, trading goods as well as passengers. Air freight often carries a combination of the two sort of thing. And if passenger numbers are really down and routes are restricted, that makes some of the trading goods a little bit harder. People like Craig and ABB, I think we'll talk about this, but particularly sort of if you've got service contracts and need engineers and others servicing activity from the UK but right around the world, that gets incredibly hard as international travel is restricted. And then things just like deal making and so on, we can do brilliant things on Zoom, but some of that sort of international diplomacy and deal making does lend itself to a little bit of face-to-face contact. And of course, right around the country, regional supply chains as well. It's not just about the airlines and the airports, important though they are, but there's huge, big supply chain issues that are really important in many of the UK regions as well. So quite a big picture of things that really matter. And I think what we'll get stuck into in the conversation just now, Liz, is actually there's a couple of things going on. One is the ongoing COVID restrictions, and we've got the traffic light system remaining in place with very few countries on green list countries so far. So the message there is that obviously as soon as it's safe to do so, can we start to grow that green list of countries? Can we make sure that we streamline the process as much as possible, testing in quarantine where there are restrictions in place on amber and then red list countries? Can we get some of the travel corridors going, for example, to the US and so on? All of those things really important as we can hopefully begin to ease some of the COVID restrictions when it's safe to do so. And then in parallel with that, what I think has probably sort of gone under the radar screen a little bit is the really important changes that came into place with the new relationship with the EU post-Brexit. Lots of the focus on that, rightly, in the initial weeks and months was around movement of goods, because that was the very visible sort of where the impact is striking. But I think partly because of COVID and international travel being so suppressed in a sense, people are not really sort of focused on the terms of the new TCA, meaning services trade is very much determined almost at an individual member state level. And for companies to wrap their heads around the new administrative processes, what that means in terms of ability to mobilize teams, needing to check that out on a country by country approach and really grapple with that, I suspect is only now really coming to the fore. So it's a good moment to get stuck into that, and Seema and then Craig's experiences will illuminate that a lot more as we get into the conversation.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And Seema, we're thrilled that you're here with us this morning. Seema Farazi, who is UK Immigration Leader for Finance Services and Brexit for EY. So you are right in the thick of this, Seema, in your role. I wonder if you might sort of kick us off a little bit to run through what has changed for UK-EU business travel specifically following the TCA, even if we put COVID to one side for a moment. Oh, has Seema frozen? Oh, I can't hear you, Seema.
That's it, sorry. I was
there we go.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree with what Matthew's just said, which is that the effects of Brexit have been somewhat muted and kind of overshadowed by the pandemic. At its most basic, we're talking about the loss of free movement rights for EU travel into the UK and UK national travel into the EU. And what we have in its place is a kind of 90 and 180-day visa-free period. And anything beyond that requires work authorization. There's quite a bit of misunderstanding about this 90-day and 180-day period. So many people are not really connecting that it doesn't mean that you can do what you did before, but only for 90 days. It actually means that you've got two things to consider. Firstly, am I spending the right amount of time in compliance with that 90 and 180-day rule across the Schengen zone? And secondly, is the activity that I'm trying to perform going to be permitted? And that's a question that UK nationals have never had to even think about before for travel into the EU. So one of the key pressure points that we're seeing is really around those restrictions on business activity in the absence of those free movement rights. Now, in the trade agreement itself, there are 11 permitted businesses and activities. But really, that doesn't tell the whole story, because each country, including the UK, including all of the members of the EU, have their own controls over immigration policy. And so some of them will have more restrictive policies than we see in the TCA. And where that is the case, they've specified those reservations in the agreement itself. But many will have much more favourable rules. And that means it's quite a resource-heavy task that businesses have to undertake to understand what are our key travel lanes, where are people going, what do we need them to do, and do we have the right governance and controls in place to make sure that those that are being asked to break, in some cases 40-year-old habits of travel and work in the EU without thinking twice about restriction, understand that new framework. We're also seeing trade agreements. So obviously the EU has an agreement with Canada, it has an agreement with Japan, it now has an agreement with the UK. And that means that there's an additional layer of complexity and really understanding exactly what the restrictions are, but at the same time, what are the flexibilities and how do we make the most of the agreement that's applicable to us? I think the key pressure point that we're seeing, and it really ties in with the pandemic, is around this mass shift to virtual working. And there's a very significant demand for cross-border remote work. And the interesting thing about that, when you look at business mobility, is that it's not based on the footprint of the company, but it's actually based on the footprint of the individual. Where do they have family? Where do they have a second home? And where do they have some connections that mean that they may want to spend part of this pandemic period in that country? And we are seeing, we have seen quite a sustained demand for cross-border remote work of UK nationals in the EU, and that is incredibly challenging. Because actually, you know, switching on your laptop and doing your job from another country is generally considered productive work. And that's where the Brexit issue kicks in, because pre-Brexit, it wasn't something that a UK national or a business supporting UK national mobility would ever have to consider. But now those things really are at the forefront of conversations, and we're seeing a lot of businesses really struggle to put structures in place to manage the volume of requests that we're seeing. I think just finally, when I talked about that 90 and 180 days, there are three fundamental challenges and complexities that we're seeing that are going to play out, particularly as the business travel volumes pick up. The first is that not all countries in the European Union are in the Schengen zone. So how that 90 and 180 days operates across different countries requires, again, quite a resource-heavy, very detailed look at when is the 90 days going to kick in, so people don't have nasty surprises, because the other complexity is that there is very strict enforcement. Any entry into the EU will be registered in the Schengen Information System, and overstays are treated quite seriously. And the third point is, of course, that day count. When people are using that 90 and 180 days, what they're being directed to is the Schengen calculator to work out when that time starts and when it stops. And the way that it calculates days is different to tax, for example. So actually your first day starts the second that you enter, even if you leave the EU on the same day. So overall, a lot of complex issues there to consider. I think the key thing is that uncertainty or a new framework obviously creates risk. And it's really important for businesses to have the right governance and controls in place, not to be complacent by suppressed business travel volumes, but really to use any, I hasten to say quiet time, because it's been anything but to use the time when business travel volumes are lower to really put in place the structure to manage that, and fundamentally to communicate to business to manage expectations, so that when people are looking to go to the EU to cover somebody, for example, for 2 weeks who might be sick, they understand actually we can't do that in the way that we could pre-Brexit. There is a process that we're going to have to follow. There is a time, there is a cost associated with it, and really to build that all into business expectation.
I just keep muting myself because I don't know if you can hear before, but it does sound, the air conditioning in this room, it sounds like someone's landing a jumbo jet on top of me. So it stopped, paused momentarily. So forgive me for muting and unmuting at will. Similar, kind of wow a bit to what you've just said. There's a lot in there. To the point, I just want to pick up on a couple of things, really basic stuff like the 90-day limit. They're not 90 consecutive days. This is what makes it challenging, because it's 90 days over the course of a year.
Well, it's 90 days over the course of a 180-day period. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So
yes, it is challenging. Yeah, and it's tricky because it also includes all visa-free travel. So that's business and personal travel. And that means kind of tracking those days effectively is really important. And that's where some of the advanced technology that we see with some businesses around business travel really kicks in and shows its worth.
And then a really good question from Maria Bellissimo, who's watching this morning. If I am an EU national, resident and employed in the UK, can I work from my home country, or do the restrictions, which way round do the restrictions apply for me in that situation?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it just points to all of the confusion that we see in this area. So from an immigration perspective, you can work in any country where you have a right to work. So that might be because you're, in this case, if you're an EU national, you can of course work in your country, and you can also work across the EU because you have a right of free movement, which includes a right to establish yourself in that country and be working for periods. What you couldn't do as an EU national is remote work in the UK. So you couldn't say, actually, I want to come to the UK for 3 months. In the UK, the visit rule is that you can spend pretty much 6 months and 12, so long as you don't intend to establish your home in the UK through successive or quite frequent visits. But what you couldn't do is remote work in the UK. And actually, the UK is one of the few countries who have been black and white clear on their policy on remote work, which is actually incredibly helpful for business. So what they have said is that if you're traveling into the UK as a visitor, and you are kind of occasionally, you're keeping up with your homework, and you're answering occasional emails, etc., or you're taking calls, then you can do that so long as it is secondary to the main purpose of your visit. What you cannot do is enter the UK with the intention of remote working. And just having that black and white clarity, even though it's not giving a huge amount of flexibility, is actually very helpful for business, because it allows them to give a really strong and clear communication to employees who are trying to stay on the right side of that compliance red line. So I think, so back to the question, you can remote work in any country where you have a right to work, be that as a national, as someone with permanent residence rights, as potentially as a family member of an EU national. What you can't do across many jurisdictions is enter as a visitor and then do your home job for prolonged periods. That's something that will typically be classed as productive work.
Gosh, okay, thank you, Seema. I don't know if it was a clever algorithm or just a coincidence, and possibly a bit of both, but on my LinkedIn feed this morning, there popped up an article that was published recently in the Times, which has in it a sort of grid of all the member states and their particular, it's a summary really, it's not intended to be legal advice, it's got a very clear disclaimer on it. But I think if Alice pops the link in the chat, I know it's behind a paywall, but it's the sort of thing that just is if you're a business and you're sitting watching this morning thinking, okay, so I'm going to have to get my head around this, it just gives you a flavour of what you might be dealing with when you start to take Seema's advice there and think about what are my key travel corridors, you know, who are the types of people that I'm needing to be moving around from place to place. It will just sort of give you a sense of what you're dealing with. Seema, I will come back to you shortly, and if you have more questions, then she's very much the expert, so please do send them in. But I'm going to come to Craig now, if I may. Morning, Craig. You're the country HR manager for a bigger sort of software electronics tech company, ABB, and you have people, or you're the HR manager for the UK, but the organisation has people all over the world, or just in Europe?
No, that's right. Thanks, Liz, and good morning, everyone. We're a global organisation. We operate in just over 100 countries. So, you know, listening there to Seema, this is an all too familiar conversation, but yeah, we're a global company. We operate very much in the technology space now, and you know, I'd say the last 15-18 months has brought many challenges, and I think Brexit is a topic that, you know, and the travel challenges that we will face, even as the pandemic subsides, you know, is one that will continue, and the discussion will continue. But I think operating, you know, in that, and I appreciate not everyone on the call will operate in a global organisation. I think some of the challenges are quite familiar or quite similar, even, you know, whether you're local and or global. And, you know, if I reflect on the last sort of 18 months, you know, I think travel, we've had a lot of time to reflect. We've had to adapt, of course. I think one of the key experiences we've had, which is very interesting in a business context, is that it's not just ABB that has been creating or saying to our customers, either locally, you know, domestically, or on an international level, hey, we're going to change the way we need to operate, or we're going to change how we do things, and because of X, Y, and Z. So we found that a lot of our customers, you know, we've been able to collaborate more in a sense, yeah, you know, and when we talk, and we link this then to sort of, you know, international business travel. Why is it important to ABB? Well, you know, we have global customers, we have global service contracts, but we also have an organization where we want to continue, and we challenge ourselves to continue to grow, not just, you know, from a UK perspective, but also on a global scale as well. So I think customers have, I'm not going to say accepting of the scenario, but we've had to work together. And I think that's probably one of the essences of ABB in terms of how we approach our relationship with customers in terms of collaboration, rather than, well, look, we need you here at this time, or that time to do X, Y, and Z.
Craig, I absolutely agree, and I think needs must is a very powerful motivator when you need to get things done and everybody has to crack on. We find reserves of innovation and creativity and adaptability that we didn't think we had, and I think that's great, and it's been borne out in a lot of sectors of people who've just one way or another sort of made it work. I guess I'd be interested to know specifically in relation to physically moving people around to do not just the sort of classic, I guess the sort of stereotype of business travel is a sort of salesperson meeting with a client to do a deal, but your organisation and lots of others like it is a very much more complicated and sort of business critical, if you like, work that the physical body of the person has to go to a place and do a thing. You can't do it over Zoom. I just wonder if you might unpack a little bit some of those, the nature of the work like that in your organisation, and what some of those challenges are that you've been experiencing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's two sides to certainly our experiences. You have the traditional sort of sales, customer engagement, customer relationship management, and then you have, the kind of the service, the installation. And we have many contracts, as an example, where, with our customers, we have service level agreements. We have to be on site, if there's an issue with any of our equipment or our software. And the customers expect that, and we want to and need to be able to continue to deliver that for the customer. I think, and again, one of the being fortunate as a global organisation, how we adapted to that. I mean, we've had to, I think, work a lot more probably with local units, where we've maybe had to leverage the skills and the resources that we have in those countries, where we have, even though it's a customer of the UK organisation. We've also, I mean, it's kind of, I think COVID, and a lot of us on the call would reflect, it's had an impact whereby it's accelerated a number of things we do in business, whether that's from operating practices, how we work, the flexibility aspect, but also in terms of technology. When we're sat around this virtual table now, it's kind of forced us to develop more or develop faster some of the technologies like remote monitoring, like remote factory acceptance testings. But I think for those practical things, Liz, that you mentioned, I mean, there's no choice. If you cannot physically mobilize your workforce, you have to look for either partners or as say for ABB, fortunate that we have local resources, skills and competence in the country to then be able to go and support on a local level.
And is that something, that local human resource planning, the different types of skills you need in different locations? Because you mentioned that one of the sort of key benefits, if you like, the competitive advantage of ABB is that you have, the ability to sort of have people where the customers are. Do you think that that's going to be a permanent shift in your organisation, to be thinking more locally about skills planning and resourcing and things?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think it will. It has to feature in the conversation. It has to feature in our business planning. It has to feature in our operating models. Because, one topic that I think has been on the fringes, and maybe Matthew touched on it earlier, is the positive impact this has had from a sustainability perspective. If we are to take any positives out of this, of course, which there are. And so we do have to consider that. We're an organisation that likes to support our customers to improve their efficiencies, to reduce their, sustainability or carbon footprint to achieve their ambitions as much as we want to achieve ours. So, yeah, I mean, we have locations where we just purely have local sales units, but we have customers where now actually it's going to bring a need for us to develop different skill sets. It's going to bring a need for us to have and be ready with different competencies to be able to support that customer. Now, how we do that, I think, there's a number of different ways in which we and many organizations can do that, but absolutely from a business continuity perspective and a planning, that is already part of the conversation.
Really interesting. Seema, we were going to talk about this too. The sort of planning for accelerating net zero and sustainability is a huge part of what EY have been working on for a long time. Same with Tortoise. I wonder, Craig can obviously talk about his particular sector, but are you seeing more general trends it's sort of a change in ideological thinking, if you like, when it comes to business travel in relation to sustainability commitments and so on?
Yes, certainly, and I think I think it's right that as mobility functions look at that future business travel model, it would be a terribly missed opportunity not to be doing that with things like sustainability, but also diversity, inclusivity, really at the core of that. And when we've surveyed, we ran a global employee survey, a Work Reimagined survey on sort of changing habits, changing employee expectations. And the majority of employees felt that their employers had done very well through this pandemic period from a values and purpose perspective. And so that's a really good starting place to really move forward with some vigour. From our own perspective, as you said, Liz, we're committed to reducing our business travel emissions by 35% from FY19 levels by 2025. And that's going to come from an overall reduction in business travel plus some offsets. Now, on the business travel reduction, business travel is obviously critical to what we do, but it's about being much more smart about how you use business travel, really making the most of some of the virtual technologies that we've leaned into to collaborate internally and really focus on very effective use of business travel. So from our perspective, we are kind of shifting our travel operating model and really focusing on business travel for things like client meetings, face-to-face with customers, etc., and trying to get to a 50% reduction in our business travel overall. I think it's really important to say that we do expect to see within EY and broader high demand for business travel coming out of the pandemic. So we do expect the first year to be very busy. And that could potentially start towards the autumn of this year. It could be delayed depending on conditions. But again, when we surveyed global employees, it's close to it was over 15,000 employees that we surveyed. 67% wanted to see a return to business travel to some extent. And so it shows that kind of pent-up demand is there, and the value of that face-to-face time, I think, is really understood across business. And that means that it's really important to have the right processes in place as you get ready to tackle that volume. I think one other thing, just building out from sustainability, it is looking at diversity and inclusivity, because we know that mobility there's a very strong correlation between mobility and global leadership talent pipelines. And it's really important that when mobility are kind of building forward their policies, they look at what adjustments have been made to our working practices, what's the positive impact on that from a D&I perspective, what's the demand for business travel from certain parts of our population, and how can we ensure that we don't develop a leadership talent pipeline problem sort of 5-10 years down the line, and really plan ahead for that now.
Yeah, really interesting. And that last point you made particularly is one that I think is sort of under-recognised when we're thinking about this in particular. I just want to go back to where we were before, Seema, when you're sort of, if I boil it down and boil it down and boil it down, your advice to organisations is get on it now and start planning if you know you're going to be needing to do a bit more of this. I think. Yes. Really interrogating why you might need to send people, both from a sustainability perspective with an eye on diversity and talent planning, but obviously why do I need to move this person from here to here, and is it allowed, is a sort of new layer of sort of planning that we haven't had to worry about before, particularly in the European Union. Are there particular resources or sources? Just before we went live, I sort of said to you, whose job is it in a big company like yours to worry about this stuff? And you're like, well, that's a big question. So I just would like to know sort of a bit more about the practicalities of where could I start this journey, and what are the sorts of structures and processes I might need to put in place that I don't have now.
Yeah, so I guess the kind of key owner of this will be global mobility functions and global immigration functions. And of course, this is going to depend on the type of business, because not all businesses will have those functions in place. It could be a handful of people trying to manage all of this very complex framework. Those that do have those structures in place, will in many cases have technology that enables business travel, that is also from a compliance perspective tracking that business travel and making sure that there is compliance across the board, because we're looking at this from the perspective of can I cross the border, can I do a permitted activity, but there are so many other elements to it. There are social security obligations, there are posted worker notifications, there are local labour laws that need to be complied with. In financial services, there will be regulatory issues, there's permanent established risk. And so it is something that touches multiple stakeholders, particularly within big business. And those that have done well have created quite a solid structure with those stakeholders at the table, understanding what is the risk ownership across all of these areas, and what's the process flow for us to manage this risk, and how do we document it and make sure that we're making this process as easy as possible, because ultimately individuals who need to business travel during this time are doing so because there is some real business need. Because obviously it's not easy to cross borders at the moment. It takes an awful lot of investment of time in testing and potentially quarantine. So it's really important that businesses are supportive of those individuals and try and make that experience as smooth as possible. There are some practical measures that can be taken even where there isn't that kind of technology that owns this challenge. Leaning into your vendors where you have them, leaning into government resources. I think we've all felt during the pandemic that there's been something of an information overload, but when you're trying to navigate complex restrictions, there's probably never too much information that you can access. So look at, back to what are our travel lanes, what are the countries where we're going to feel pressure, what are the resources that we can tap into that we feel comfortable in understanding, where we don't have vendors to lean into, and really making sure that there are communications that go out regularly around travel, that those that are being asked to travel for the business understand that there is a process for them to go through, which is largely protecting them as opposed to designed to hinder them, because nobody wants to set off for business travel and find for a 5-day trip and find that they're subject to a 2-week mandatory quarantine. There are 3 control points that need to be factored into the conversation. Is there an exit control that applies, i.e. can I leave, for example, can I leave the UK for this purpose and be able to get back in? What's the entry control that applies in the country that I'm landing in, or in any subsequent countries that I'm going to travel to? And can I get back into the country that I've departed from? So those are the kind of 3 points that have to be considered from a pandemic perspective. Back to Brexit, the overarching question is, from a regulatory and legislative standpoint, can I do the activity that I'm trying to do? And again, the immigration system hasn't changed in the EU. It's the same as it has been for US, Canadian, Indian, Australian nationals. It's just that we're experiencing it, UK nationals are experiencing it for the first time. Yeah. And that means that it does take quite a lot of effort really to get everyone on board and to get everyone comfortable with that new landscape.
Thanks so much, Seema. Craig, I saw you nodding in recognition when Seema was talking. I wonder, in your practical experience, this is quite a significant duty of care factor, to Seema's point about sending people off and them getting stuck or not being able to come back and all that kind of thing. And obviously that's a big facet, well, for all leaders and managers, but particularly for HR. What is the group of people in ABB that run this stuff? Do you have that global mobility team that Seema talked about, or is it a different setup in your business?
No, and rightfully it is complex. And we do have a global mobility function, but we also, we have local teams as well. So across all manners of Brexit planning over the last 12, 18 months, people movement has been a key aspect. So we take the pandemic to one side, I think, as Seema said, just for one moment. It's not new, but it is more complex because it's not an area that we're comfortable operating in or we're knowledgeable.
We're not used to it, are we?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we will over time. But you're right in terms of duty of care. We, not just as an organisation, but on an individual level. And I think how we approached it, we've tried to approach it as practical as possible. I mean, there's a couple of different aspects to people mobility. There's people mobility where we say, look, back to the leadership pipeline conversation earlier, we want to send this individual on an international assignment for I don't know, 3 to 5 years. And we have that, 10% of our workforce in the UK are either on a long-term or a short-term assignment. But then there's also then sort of the short-term business visitor aspect where we need to send people for sales, service, or just general business travel. So I think breaking it down into those groups has helped us a lot. I think trying to be practical but simple has also helped. I mean, look, there's still areas that we're working through, and we will as the borders start to open up a little bit more. But I think there's a fundamental question here. What can we and what should we be doing in terms of people mobility? And it kind of wraps this whole conversation up again around the sustainability aspect without negating, sort of the customer need and balance that we have to maintain, but also in terms of the people development. And, I regularly traveled a lot before the pandemic. I don't, hopefully planning a trip in September, but the first question now I think that comes into our kind of cultural mindset is, well, is it needed? Is it really, really needed? So is it customer? Is it not? Is it internal? Is it not? And then working through, well, what are the practicalities? I think just maybe a final point on this. Part of it, as complex as it may be, and as easy as this may sound to say it, I think you've kind of got to do it. And again, it's the pandemic piece aside. We've been taking some of our business leaders, senior business leaders through practicalities. Well, how do I get an A1 certificate? Where have you been traveling to recently? Where are your top 5 customer sites country-wise? And really kind of focusing on understanding the requirements there for those specific countries, and also maybe taking a planning approach. So where do we have those customer contracts? Where do we have the quick response, or well, we know we're going to have to be in this country at this time, and then kind of building the capability around that, as opposed to just the general sort of carte blanche. Hey, we're going to go and start traveling again when everything starts to operate.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Craig. So I can see that Alex has shared a link in the chat to the government EU guidance that Seema spoke about. I think if I can summarise, what we're saying is don't panic, but do prioritise and do get planning, because it is fiddly. There's no quick answer, annoyingly. It would be lovely if the answer was, oh, you just need this form and you go down the post office and sort yourself out. Unfortunately, it isn't quite as simple as that. But thank you very much to both Craig and to Seema for their generosity with their insights and lots of detail. Matthew, I wonder if just for the last minute or so, we might come back to you. What do you think we need to hear from the government on this over the next sort of 3 to 6 months or so?
Yeah, well, thanks, Liz. I mean, look, a few things. One, watch out for the 28th of June. I think we've got a review and an update from the Global Travel Task Force then, so keep an eye out for that, I would say. Secondly, good that Alice has just popped the link in the chat. I was going to mention, actually, Seema touched on the sort of government guidance as well. That very helpful and welcome. Do get across that if you're a business that this really sort of touches on, I'd say, on that country by country basis. So that'd be sort of point number 2, and keep that guidance coming. And then third, back on the sort of broader COVID piece beyond the international travel, I would say, we'll just keep up the pressure and do share with us your insights where these changes or lack of changes in progress are pinching, because we really want to make sure we're getting good targeted support as a bridge through to the other side when the restrictions hopefully are able to lift on the 19th of July. So that'll be our priorities and actions for the next couple of weeks, Liz.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed to Craig and to Matthew and to Seema for joining us this morning. Of course, to you all for watching and listening. The webinar next is on Monday with the top boss, Tony Danker, who will be doing a session with Emran Mian and Lucy Winkskill on levelling up. So join us for that on Monday at 10. As I always say, go and put the kettle on, have a cup of tea before you open your emails. Have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.